A very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. Now, this week's episode of My Community is carried by Mrs. Grace Williams, who celebrated her 90th birthday on June 25th. Belated birthday greetings to you, Mrs. Williams. You are looking very well. Although the primary focus will be on My Lord's Hill and the Ivy, Mrs. Williams spends a little time introducing us to her father, a celebrated Barbadian. Interestingly enough, it is a story that started not at the St. Giles School, where his name is emblazoned, nor at the primary school in the Pine, where his name is inscribed, but next to a Methodist church in the northwestern corner of St. Lucie.
Yeah, my father lived St. Lucie. The house was opposite, I think they call it Sealer's Methodist Church. The house is right opposite that. They have rebuilt it now. Well, when I could see, I saw it, you know. But that's where my father grew up, because I knew my grandfather as well. My mother came from St. Lucie as well. She came from Grape Hall. And I think, well, not me, but I think the Jordans still have land at Grape Hall. Because, you know, in those days, when a parent died, everything went to the eldest boy in the family. And I think the land we had there probably went to Basil Jordan, which is Oscar and Frankie's father.
Okay.
So I think they sold off some of it, but I still think I think they still have land there. I think Oscar used to say about it, but I don't know who does. Now he's gone.
The discussion on her father will continue at intervals throughout this episode. But let us move from St. Lucie to St. Michael. Grace Williams takes us back to her childhood days as she speaks about her family and that sad occasion when her father informed her that she had to leave school early because of sad news which changed the family dynamics forever.
I remembered myself first at by Lord's Hill. It's a house right opposite Belmont Church. My father named the house after himself, Charlesville. And that's where I remember my beginnings. It was my brother and my sister Merle, my sister Nan, my sister Gwen, and myself. My brother left school on Friday, and he decided he was going to join the war. He sailed out this Saturday. I don't even remember much about what he looked like. On that same trip, the amount of people that were going out was Errol Walton Barrow and his cousin Graham. And we used to have a picture of the batch that went out that day. Well, as you know, Mr. Barrow came back, but my brother didn't. He died, I think it was in March. I always remember I was at school. I went to school at St. Giles. At the time, I was the only girl there. And my father came to the class that I was in, and he said, "We are going home." And I never argued with my father. And I just got up and I left. And I would always remember when I got to, there's a place, they call it Breakneck Hill. Yes. In My Lord's Hill. And there used to be a passage where you can walk over this, it was a well or something that was covered there. But people used to walk over it. And you could walk between houses and come out in the street. I think it led to the ivy, the back ivy. and where Canon Tudor lived. And midway there, I asked my father if it was about my brother, Gray, and he said yes. And I realized that he had lost his life. And we never spoke again about it. And by the time we got home, he went, he told my mother. And the house was like dead silent. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. I don't remember her crying, but the house seemed like it had a quietness over it. And lots of people came in the afternoon to visit. That is one thing I remembered very clearly. I remember the very spot that I asked him. I don't know if to still have a pathway between from one street to the other. And on that hill used to be a house where Gilmore Rochford lived. When I was growing up, I used to call it Rochford. Yes, yes. He grew up on that site where St. Giles Girls' School is. They had a house there. It is not longer there. And the Vaughns lived there after they left.
Harcourt Fitzgerald Gilmore Rochford was the last surviving Barbadian of the defunct West Indies Federal Parliament. He died July 26, 2015 at the age of 91. Now, you would appreciate that Grace, in her time, her community was vastly different. There were fewer houses in the ivy. A young Grace spent the majority of her social life with her siblings and close relatives. She reveals the story of the fallen hat rack.
What I remember is that our family, this is the Jordan family, they were very close-knit, and there was a big family, and there was always a family gathering. At the drop of the hat, there was something we would all get together. And that went on for years. So much so that I had very few friends outside of my family because we were so closely knit. My father was a quiet man. Strangely enough, I've never heard him quarreling with my mother. I knew that he was the head of the household because he was strict, and yet still I don't remember in what way he demonstrated that he was strict. And lots of people used to come to him to discuss their children with him. I remember Edson Innes, this is Dr. Innes. His father used to come every Sunday. He had Edson and his brother John, I think were at school the same time. And I, a little girl, used to play around the table. It was a very long table. And they used to sit at one end, and just behind them was this hat rack. And I used to play around till one day the hat rack came came down and struck Mr. Ennis in his back. Of course, I disappeared, That was one time I thought my father would lash me. And I left Mr. Ennis, and my father continued to talk. And funny enough, my father never lashed me, never asked me anything about it. But I never visited that area again another Sunday. I remember that clearly. And they were very quiet. I never knew what they talked about. It must have been about Mr. Innes's children, but the voices were never raised. I wasn't listening to them, I was just playing around, My father was a Methodist, but I don't know where he started. I know he went to parish school, that I know. I don't know when he was teaching, which was his first school. But I knew, what I heard about is he was transferred to St. Simon's, St. Andrew, and he lived there for many years. We had many friends from St. Andrew. One was a Mr. Thompson. His son, I can't remember his name. He was a doctor. He grew up in our house as well, St. Elmo. Yeah. eye specialists. And we had many friends from um, St. Simon's days, like the Skeets. And he was a headmaster as well, and even the Smiths we knew from St. Andrew. And then after St. Andrew, my father came to St. Giles.
And there began a long association with the school, the community, and the family members. Now, quite a number of individuals who appeared on previous episodes of My Community spoke of her father's contribution.
What I don't know is where the school was when he first took it on, because where St. Giles is now, it was a house, because I remember living there. I remember the hall, where the hall is. I only remember one part of the hall. I remember we had this bad weather, and my mother sitting in a chair, and my sibling, the one just over me, and she had us next to us. I don't think I've ever heard any thunder or heard or seen any lightning like that in my lifetime since. But she just had us there. I don't know much about where the bedrooms were, but I know we lived there. And then we moved to My Lord's Hill. And I don't know how many years we lived there. But when my brother died, we were still in My Lord's Hill. And then we moved to the Ivy. Well, it was very quiet. Next to the school, the St. Giles School, was a Mr. Yearwood. Well, I didn't realize that he had all that land now that they have made into a housing area. Right opposite where he lived was his. I didn't realize that until quite recently. But he lived there, and then they had the Hunts. These were all Caucasian people.
There is one commonality as it relates to the headmasters of those days. From primary school to primary school all across this island, the stories have been the same as it relates to the use of the strap or the bamboo by the headmaster.
Yeah, but this said my father liked to lash. But strangely enough, I was thinking I can never remember any occasion that he lashed me. I suppose I was the last, so he probably got away, but I don't remember his lashing the others either. And he was a quiet man, you know. I never heard him raise his voice, yet still you knew when he was around. I don't know what it was about him, but you know. He really did a lot for St. Giles. My cousin Lancy Bannister said once that he could teach a crapo, or he could, I don't know what made him say that, but of course he's an agriculturalist and a doctor. So that's probably why he expressed it that way. But they had a lot of boys who used to go. Some of the famous ones that I remember, Sir Neville Nichols, and his brother Courtney. Courtney lived, I think, in Jamaica, but he was here for a short time over Lodge School as headmaster. And I remember every Sunday afternoon, my father would drive up. They lived in Sweet Bottom. Used to call it Sweet Bottom. It's now changed the name, but it used to be called Sweet Bottom. It's just a strip of, not a very long street. And up to the right, on the left, on the right-hand side, I always remember Mr. Nichols lived there, and we would visit on Sunday afternoons to talk about his boys, I suppose.
Many well-known Barbadians were the students of her father. Among these were a well-known parliamentarian and former cabinet member, Sir Louis Tull.
Not only Louis, his brother, his elder brother as well. Can't remember his name. He now runs
the hotel.
a hotel, yeah.
Golden Sands.
Golden Sands, yes. Dennis, isn't it?
Yes.
Right. He also went to St. Giles. Who else remember? I don't know if you all heard of Jeffrey Rudders. He was one of his boys as well. Those are the ones that I, I can remember offhand. There were so many. Lot, some of them went overseas to study and never came back. I know he used to have plays. I, well, I don't know if he himself used to operate it, but when they had speech days, the speech days were very special. There was plays, and the parents would come and they would have the dignitaries from the Ministry of Education. And they're very good at sports as well. Fellow Merton Robinson, I think he did the coaching when I was there, I think. I was invited there once by the headmistress, and we took a picture of my father for them. I framed it, and took it.
Here now to experiences of entering school and her exploits in track events.
My father wanted me to go to the convent. I don't know why, but he didn't tell me that. But obviously my mother wanted me to go to college. And I remember on the day that they used to have entrance exams, not like they have the screening test, as they call it, but when you were going into secondary school, they would give you an exam to know which form to put you in. And I rode down to Queen's College. I don't know what my sister went for, but we rode down there the morning that they were having exams. And there was a maid. She was like a mother to all the children. Her name was Ben. And she said, "Miss Gwen, what's your sister not here?" So she said, my sister couldn't answer. But anyhow, when we got back home, she told Mom that Ben had asked her why I wasn't there. My mother took up pen and paper, and she wrote my father a note. And fortunately, school was fairly near. It was near. And I don't know what she said in the note, but then he appeared, and they told me to dress, and they took me down to Queen's College. But of course, most people had finished the exam, so they told me come next day. My mother went home. She took one of my sister's uniforms, and she cut it down. And next morning, I went to school in a uniform, and I stayed at Queen's College until I left. So it really seems as though the women ruled the roost. And I didn't hear any arguments, but he came right away, and the three of us went down to Queen's College. I remember they had a teacher, a math teacher. She was very, very good. She had 3 children. Let me see, what was her name? One was Annie, one was Ronnie, and another Aunt Pat. She was a very, very good teacher. She used to teach maths. I remember her. I remember Daphne Joseph Hackett. The first time I ever had running shoes, we were having sports day. And it was the first and only time my father had ever come to see me run. And when I put on these shoes, instead of Miss Hackett telling me, you cannot wear those shoes, I'm on the court and she's shouting at me, and I will never forget that, Embarrassed me in front of my father, If she didn't want me to wear the shoes, she should have said something, And I always remember that. This was on the what used to be Combermere. That was that lawn. It was run on that lawn. Anyhow, I took off my shoes and I still won the race. They didn't have school sports in those days, but we had internal sports, and I was victrix ludorum for the houses. The houses used to run against each other, But I only represented Barbados on 2 occasions. They sent me to Guyana once, and then the same person that I ran against, she came and there was a meeting here, and I ran against her again. But in my day, they didn't send people to the Olympics. I think Patsy Callender must have been the first person that they really sent anywhere, you know. The only place they ever sent me was Guyana. And I had no training. My Mrs. Wharton, that school, she was a very good teacher. She was our physical educational teacher. She was very, very good. And I believe that made me, well, active. And running seemed to be just normal with me, you know. And this was barefooted, you know. I'll tell you how I realized I could run. At Harrison College, the boys' school, when they had their sports day, they used to have an invitational race. And I remember going at least once to their sports day. And they would encourage girls, come and run. There was a one race for visitors. And the thing is, you have to take off your shoes and socks. And I ran and I won. And that is how I started to run, you know. The race that I won here against this Pearl from Trinidad, she had beat me in Guyana. And soon after that, there was a race here. And Bob Cumberbatch, who, I don't remember what he did. He also had a son who used to run, Edward Cumberbatch. He invited me to come down to Kensington for my starts. They figured out what was wrong with my racing because I didn't start promptly. So he came down, he gave me a few lessons of starting.
And the rest, as they say, is history. Young Grace ran so swiftly that she was referred to as Bullet. Now back to the community and a listing of those individuals who, through their special skills and talent, met the needs of community members.
My uncle was a shoemaker, so I didn't have to. But we had like Mrs. Springer. I know what was her name? The Springers lived in the Ivy, and her mother, she was Ermy, and Pat, and Michael, and Harry. Their mother was a dressmaker, and I will, and she was a very kind lady. I'd never forget when my father died. I was pregnant at the time, and before I could think about what I was going to wear or anything, Mrs. Springer had a dress made for me. She did not measure me or anything, and I wore it to my father's funeral. And I always remember how kind that was, of her. She was a very kind person, very soft-spoken.
Speaking of funerary work, there is a funeral home in this community that remains an institution in itself.
Well, remember, I think it was Addison Tudor's driver. I think was the horse and buggy. And this man used to call him, oh dear, forgotten. He had a long neck.
Bottleneck.
Bottleneck, that's right. Just call him Bottleneck. And he wore this hat. I remember him. Oh, yes. Yeah, but Addison Tudor, because now they're in the 5th generation of operators, Oh, really? Yeah, this is the 5th generation. Atherstone was, I don't know if he was the first, and then there was Dennis, and his daughter now is the 3rd, so there must have been 2 above them, 2 above Atherstone.
Mrs. Williams speaks now with pride of recommending a number of names to the Ministry of Transport and Works as she sought to bring about a greater kingship and a sense of identity in the community.
I lived at Holloway in the Ivy, but Wilkie Street is adjacent to the Ivy. Funny enough, they only have 2 houses in Wilkie Street. I figured that the postman would have to know where to come. So I decided to write Ministry of Transport and suggest names to them. I think at the time, Sir Fred Smith was minister, and they chose 90 Wilkie Street. So that's how the name, so that name only went up in 1986. It wasn't there before.
It was accepted.
It was accepted. I suggested a few names and they picked out Wilkie Street. But the last time I saw the sign in, I think, the Ivy Road, it was split. The sign was split. I don't know if they ever went to do anything about it.
As expected, we checked, and Mrs. Williams would be pleased to learn they did something about it. The name of Wilkie Street is placed aloft for all to see, providing direction to the street. Mrs. Grace Williams with childhood memories of her community. Thank you, Mrs. Williams. This has been My Community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. The program continues next week at the same time.